welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
I am beyond excited. I've been following you online. I've read your books, and I just want to first thank you for everything that you've done for us parents, because you take the research and really make it so simple. All the visuals in Beyond Behaviors, the iceberg and the easy worksheets that we can work on. And now your new book, I'm excited to talk about everything and to share this with parents.
I am so grateful. I'm so grateful because, I value this information. I think it can reduce suffering out there for parents, for teachers, and for most of all for children. So I'm really, really excited to talk to you tonight.
Let's start with the tantrums. I'm saying this as I hear some going on in the background. My husband's giving baths, and there are two very unhappy out of 3 kids right now.
Yes,
but it's so hard. I talk to parents, and I think sometimes we hear a lot about staying calm in the moment and just being like so zen, and then parents are boiling inside and don't know, or they lash out and they scream and they don't know what to do in these moments. And I get it, because sometimes it's just hard. But you have such a beautiful way of looking at these behaviors and these tantrums and big emotions. Where do we start? As parents, if somebody's listening and they're like, every time my child screams or has these meltdowns or tantrums, I can't control myself. Like, where do we begin?
Right. Well, we begin with the word that I think is the most important word in parenting. We begin with self-compassion. That is, we literally or figuratively put a hand over our heart and realize when we're triggered. Because I think a lot of parents feel guilty for being triggered, or when your child is in a tantrum, then you start getting really upset and activated. We tend to think, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm a bad parent. But we have to understand that these instinctual automatic reactions really come from the body and not from our thinking mind, our intentionality as parents, even people like me who know this information and who know how important it is to stay calm. Sometimes our body shifts into a different pathway, and we're not always aware of what that trigger is. And we all have histories. We all come to the table as a parent with our own different histories and our own different triggers. So I think, first of all, if we feel triggered, if you feel like you're maybe falling short on parenting because you feel upset a lot, or you get agitated when your child gets agitated, please know you're not alone. It's a very human response. And we're just beginning to discover more about this whole idea about co-regulation. How do we stay calm when our child is having such a hard time, a meltdown, thrashing around? It's very difficult to do, actually, but we can talk about how we can, make it into easy steps.
I think that a big part of this as well is a bit of a mindset. So you mentioned the self-compassion part, but I find for me that mindset shift of how I view a tantrum. So I like similar to you, I came into parenting and I was like, I got this. I've read the research, I've got this. And then my firstborn started having a few tantrums closer to 2.5, 3. And I was like, I don't have this. I have no control over this, because I had never really anticipated. I had never experienced a tantrum. No adult had thrown a blue cup at me because they weren't happy that I gave them what they asked for. I didn't know how to deal with that. And it just surfaced so many different aspects of myself that I didn't know I had. And a lot came from my own childhood. So I think the first thing I also, was discovering myself, but the way that I was viewing her tantrums, and I had to keep reminding myself, we look at it as bad behavior. I was raised where anything that was other than happiness was you being disrespectful and being bad. You shouldn't be angry about something because I gave you this house and the food in front of you, and that's how it should be. Do you think that part of it, I'm assuming yes, because of your books, but what is it that, does that mindset shift make a difference for parents?
I think that mindset shift is the kernel of the paradigm shift in how we understand human behavior, actually, how we understand children, how we understand parenting. Because chances are we were raised with parents who believed that all the behaviors are, intentional, volitional, either good or bad behaviors, respectful or disrespectful behaviors, or those emotions that they were afraid of. Like if we were scared, they may say, and again, well-meaning parents, no blame, no shame,
Yeah,
mom,
yeah,
dad.
yes,
But to say, there's nothing to be afraid of, or you shouldn't be so angry. There are many children in the world who'd have far less than you.
yes.
Those kinds of
Yeah.
there's so those kinds of things that are in our cultural DNA
Mm,
because we don't properly understand the stress response.
mm,
So I'll never forget, I was, I had two, I know I'd had, I think all three of my children. I was in a study group in Los Angeles, a neuro physiology study group, and the leader just kept on pounding into the conversation that we need to understand the difference between top down and body up
mm,
behaviors. And once it sunk in, I just had tears running down my face because I had a child, a daughter, that I was disciplining and using, the great cognitive behavioral methods that I had been taught in the last decade of all those years of graduate school, a Ph.D. psychology. And I realized I was barking up the wrong tree.
mm,
She wasn't a behavior problem. She had difficulty calming her nervous system.
mm,
And I think that that mind shift and why I named the first was actually the second book I wrote, Beyond Behaviors, is that we need to become more sophisticated in how we view behaviors, our human children behaviors, and we're not talking about it enough, in my opinion.
No, we're not. I agree with you. Actually, coming back to that book, can you describe that iceberg that you talk about? And I
Yeah,
love how you painted for each child because then it might not look the same, right? Maybe
right.
if you paint a picture, it'll help parents to view this when they're trying, with their own child.
Yes. Well, there's a popular saying now that's behaviors have meaning.
Mhm.
And I think that's a great a saying, but it needs more specificity. So when I was thinking about how to communicate, well, in my practice, actually, I would draw these icebergs. I would kind of say, like, I was working with a family with a child with challenging behaviors, which is my specialty, and I would find myself drawing like, okay, here's the tip of the iceberg. Here are the behaviors we see: the kicking, the screaming, the running away, or the whatever, whatever have you, those challenging behaviors. And then underneath the waterline, I'd say like in an iceberg, you don't see, if you're in a boat above the water, you don't see what's below, but that's like 80 to 90% of the big chunk of ice. So for each child, there are potentially millions of causes for the triggers, for the nervous system distress, for the behaviors. And we have to look at each child individually. So in that book, Beyond Behaviors, I also have a blank iceberg. So
Mhm.
you can write the behaviors of above for your child, and then below, you can start to think about, and I, those reasons. And we go from everything from the body to sensory processing to thoughts and emotions. We put them in four different big buckets, but they're literally, every child is different and we all have different triggers.
I love that you bring up sensory processing whenever in these books because it's something that we didn't talk about. And I was actually speaking to my mother-in-law about this today. And she's like, we
Uh,
never knew about that in my day. We never spoke about that. And even now, she's a teacher in elementary school and
mm,
they don't know about this. And I have a friend who struggles, her child struggles a little bit with the sensory sensitivity. And just turning the lights down or realizing that there's a lot of noise around the child makes a big difference in their behavior. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of sensory sensitivities?
yeah, this is such an exciting area
Mm.
of, oh my gosh, this area is so exciting.
Yeah, I agree because I find it helps so many kids that might have been misunderstood for so long.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So about 25 years ago, I don't know if you've read some of the work of Stanley Greenspan, but Stanley Greenspan, Serena Wieder were um, they began an organization called the 0 to 3 Foundation, the National Clearinghouse for Infants and Toddlers, or something like that. And so their very early research introduced this idea of individual differences. What they noticed in their research was that babies had different capacities in how they were taking in information from the environment, which is the way we live. We breathe, we hear, we smell, we touch. That's how we are in the world. We meaning humans and even mammals, right? And so this idea that humans process information and all information is sensory differently blew my mind. So with those children that I was working with, especially the toddlers, that some of the typical toddlers that I work with are kids who may be literally asked to leave several preschools for challenging behaviors, right? Whose concern, whose family and schools are concerned about their harming somebody else by throwing something, right? Or running out in the street. And so when we took this lens of looking at each of their sensory systems, and I have to say, I came upon this from a completely different field of occupational therapy. And I studied with occupational therapists at 2 training programs at universities here in medical center here in Los Angeles. I was trailing OTs, or pediatric occupational therapists, for 5 years. And that's where I learned that the stress response of human behaviors is coming from the way each child processes sensory information. And if that sounds a little complicated, just think about it as we parents are sensory information, our voices, our smells, how we move our body. and some of us trigger our own children without even knowing it. So, yeah, that whole sensory processing. So come to 2022 this year, and starting from 2017 or 18, like about 5 years ago, I began studying also Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. And she has done a lot of research in something called interoception, which is the sensory system that is coming from our insides, our gut, our viscera, our organs, and our hormone system, feeding up to the brain that's causing these basic feeling states. So it's like this arc of 30 years is starting to really, really come together in the neuroscience world. But believe me, that's kind of ivory tower. They aren't clinicians. And I know you're a neuroscientist, but you are a mom and you're practical. But a lot of people are doing lab studies on animals or theories, and we have to take it out of the ivory tower, in my opinion, and into our living rooms, our kitchens, our bedrooms.
Yes, quickly, because kids need this. The children need this research. Yeah.
Oh, Cindy, kids need this, and especially, I think all kids and families need this, but here in the States, I've been pleading with organizations, our government, to look at our foster children. That's a subset of children that we know have experienced developmental trauma. The reason they're foster children is that they've had early relational or developmental trauma. And if we look at those children under the old lens of behavioral management, or I should say when we do, the treatments that we are giving them are actually making their behaviors worse. Yeah.
This has to change. And we know
this has to
research that it doesn't make sense to me sometimes that it's not changing quickly enough. Because we have the research to back this up, and even Dr. Perry talks about this. Like, I mean, there's just so much around this. And in terms of the children too, I'm sure there are parents that are listening that might have adopted a child and are wondering how to approach this, and they might still have that lens of bad behavior and consequences and discipline. how do we get out of that as a parent too, if we're just seeing a lot of non-compliance and things that, a child doing things that might be harmful to them or to those around them? How do we see that beyond the behavior, as you said, when there's just so much that we're not seeing that's internal and part of, in their body?
Right, right. Well, the first thing we can do is ask ourselves, when you see a behavior, especially if it comes on very quickly and it doesn't really make sense, right?
Yeah.
If it seems like a child maybe, I don't like this word, but overreacting to a
Mhm.
situation, right? It's and I guess we may also say that children, if you have adopted a child, certain children are more vulnerable. Children with trauma are more vulnerable, but children like my own daughter, who had a very stable home, but she had very profound sensory processing differences and autonomic differences, are very vulnerable. So it doesn't mean that your child has trauma. It means that your child is experiencing these moments of distress very powerfully. So the first thing we do is check out, is this a top down or body up behavior? If it's top down, then like a child maybe steals something
Mhm.
or hides something and lies about it. Those are tender, difficult parenting moments where we can confront the situation with boundaries and logic and natural consequences, things like that. That's a very different scenario from a child who maybe you're having dinner and all of a sudden they start to turn red and get very upset and maybe um, throw some food
Mm.
because something has upset them. That's what we would call a stress behavior or a body up behavior. And then, so figuring out the difference is really important, because in that situation we wouldn't go to reasoning and consequences and thinking and
Yes.
talking.
Yes, exactly.
We would go to stabilizing our nervous systems together.
Mm. I
Yeah.
love that you've just contrasted that, because I think as parents sometimes, especially with new parents experiencing tantrums for the first time, or even behavior that's more challenging with an older child, I think we go into the mode of like regulating right away, like teaching them as they're crying or upset. It's like, I got, either you're trying to calm them or you're getting upset at them, and it's not the right moment. You really need to think about, especially if it's body up sort of thing, where you just not need to help their system calm down.
Yeah, and it's so, and please, I mean, it's natural for us to do that.
Of course.
So
Yeah. I do
yeah,
it all the
it's so
time.
natural to
Yeah.
want to calm them down as quickly as possible and give them some context.
Yeah.
And words are great. So I
Yeah.
mean, for a toddler who's just like bereft because they got the blue cup
Yeah.
and but they really wanted the pink cup. Um, just it's very tempting to just say, "Well, it's still a cup, honey," or
Mm.
"I know you're very, very disappointed," which could work, but maybe taking a step back and just thinking about the nervous system first, like,
Mm.
"Oh, that was a surprise."
Mm.
When we say something like that to a toddler, because there's something called prediction error going on,
Oh,
their
yes.
brain was a half a second ahead thinking,
Yeah.
"I know I'm getting that blue cup. I just know it." And when the pink cup comes along, it's a body up response. It
Yes.
feels dreadful. That
Yes.
we adults can't understand that because we can't remember our own prediction errors as toddlers.
I love
It's so
I
great.
can you talk, I guess you just described it, but the prediction error thing, you talked about that. Is that in your newer book? I remember reading about that. But I
Yeah,
can't
that's in
remember
the
which
new
one.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I love that.
that comes from the theory of constructed emotions in
Mm.
Barrett's lab, and um, I really think it's so fascinating to think about the brain as a prediction machine.
Mm.
And the way the brain works is through statistical learning, which means the more experiences you have, the better you're going to get at predicting. And think about how few experiences toddlers have in variation,
Mm.
right? And in life experience. So that's one of the reasons the brain loves predictability. Humans love to predict what's going to happen next. And I say that like that's conscious and subconscious. So when a toddler maybe is expecting to stay at grandma and grandpa's house, and they find out that they have to leave in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
That is can be, if they're having so much fun and they're predicting they have longer.
Yes. I'm
Ouch.
laughing because this is exactly what happened to me tonight. We were talking earlier before,
Yeah.
and Mike, I was looking at the time and I said, guys, we need to leave. I'm recording a podcast tonight. I tried to help them, and by the time we got here, it was a difficult scene, but
It
it's
was
exactly that.
chaos.
It's like, and then grandma and grandpa offered ice cream right before we left, but there was no time left. And I told grandma and grandpa that we had to leave. So it was, and I get it. I mean, if you put
Yes.
yourself in a place of compassion and inside your child's brain or body, you kind of realize, well, yeah, that's not fun. Like, I could have stayed, had ice cream, stayed up later, and instead of having to go home to go to bed. Yeah,
Right.
it's a bad choice.
Which one sounds better? And then there's this other thing that comes in, and it's called self-regulation. And as adults, when we get hit with a prediction error, like when something bad happens, like, I don't know, we were getting ready to go to a big dinner where my mom was being honored for some charity work she did. And my husband had to go to the hospital. Something happened. So it was a huge disappointment, but the prediction error was taken care of by self-regulation, saying, well, we have priorities. This is more important. They will film it. I'll be able to see it later. Our adult brains can frame disappointments and prediction errors. Most healthy adults, right? Parents can frame our prediction errors. And we expect that children should be able to as well, but they don't have that ability yet. So very, very good little children, which I'm sure yours are, like beautiful, good little children, can't just say, oh, we understand. That ice cream looks so good, but look forward to it in a week from now. That just doesn't happen. That's not developed yet.
No, exactly.
It's not developed yet.
And I think this touches a little bit upon the topic you mentioned, like in your new book, it's the expectation gap. That really made me like sit a little bit and say, you know what, we do sometimes, we do have this. Is it like you're talking like these high expectations? I'm guessing when we think of our kids.
Yeah, it's actually, the gap is the difference between what a child is reliably able to do according to their neurodevelopment, their development, and what they're actually able to do in the moment. So this is one reason that it's tricky, because as parents we think, oh, they were able to do that yesterday or this morning, so certainly we know they have that ability to do it now. And with toddlers, that expectation gap lives because their ability to manage their emotions and behaviors floats throughout the day according to so many different variables that underneath the iceberg idea, right? So the expectation gap is when we believe a child should be able to pull it together and manage something. For example, we expect that they can do something that developmentally they don't reliably yet have that ability. That's why it's so tricky, because it feels like they can't. Even toddlers are so conversant. They're so bright, right? They're amazing. They can talk to us. They can tell stories. They're so cute.
Yeah, they are.
But their mental abilities are one thing, but their self-control abilities are another. And that's mostly what the expectation gap is about.
The more we see it this way, I think the more compassionate we can be, when our child has these big behaviors or big emotions, because we're starting to understand what's going on inside their brain and their body and what's contributing to all these behaviors. I'm thinking back to that iceberg that you mentioned, and I feel that, I maybe some parents, we could understand it when it comes to toddlers and preschool
Mhm.
children, because it's the hitting, it's the yelling, it's the, it's things that make, or a little bit easier perhaps to address, and you could say like they're tired or it's sensation or whatever it is. But what happens when they're a little bit older,
Yeah.
early elementary school and elementary school? Are we still using that, iceberg, or is it shifting?
That's a great question. And we actually are using the iceberg on adults, on ourselves. So it's throughout the lifespan.
Makes sense. Yeah.
It makes sense. The things under, inside of the bottom of the iceberg are shifting as we age. But let me address that. I think that's a very important comment that you made, because we really need to look at developmental age and not chronological age. So there are very many developmentally young elementary school kids, fourth graders, fifth graders, 10, 11, 12. I've worked with many, many developmentally young teenagers who may have less self-regulatory abilities than a 5-year-old. So, it's according to your developmental stage, not your how old you are. And so many different pieces go into social and emotional development.
That is
Um,
such an important part.
it's such an important part.
I think that is something, emotion regulation skills and social emotional skills, I think, are two things that I've been trying to be a bit more vocal about, because I think that in terms of preschool years and even early elementary school, we place a lot of focus on academic skills, which are important. I'm not saying they're not, but we need to place a lot more importance as a society and as a health system on these skills, for the child's well-being, their future, and all of that. They're just so important. And I've described a little bit of this tripartite model of parental socialization, which touches on the three aspects that help a child build their emotion regulation skills. And parents are a huge part. They're one of the three major parts, and the parents' relationships, within the home. And I'm thinking back to the past 2 years and the emails I've received from parents, struggling with themselves, with their own mental health, with relationships within the home. And a lot of it goes back to her childhood, and some people, it goes back to trauma and when they were very young. So, you know, I guess with all of this, like, where do we begin the work and the healing?
Mm. Well,
It's
just
a big question.
it's such a big
Yeah.
question, but all those comments and emails that you and I got during the pandemic really, I think, revealed that vulnerability that we all have inside, because so much of our structures, our social structures, were taken away or changed, and so much fear was entered into our environment. So Dr. Stephen Porges talks about cues of safety and cues of threat. Our world was filled with cues of threat, and in many ways it continues to be for different reasons. We have a horrible spat of gun violence here in the States. And yeah, so how do we make sense of it? Where do we start? Where does healing begin? And I really think that it begins with this idea of awareness. And I have so much compassion for parents and for the burdens we carry. But the parents that I've worked with that have had the most relief are those who are able to kind of tune in to the wisdom of their bodies. So many parents have histories where their body had to go into this fight or flight system in order to manage or to cope. And not because necessarily they had a trauma history, but maybe they had working parents, and maybe they were the oldest and they had to make all the lunches and make sure everyone was, okay. Or maybe they were just a very anxious child and the parents didn't know it because the anxiety was hidden inside. So tuning into those cues from the body is such a gift we can give ourselves. And sure enough, those the studies are showing that those adults who can cue into those cues from that are coming from inside, those interoceptive cues, have less inflammation in their body. So lower blood pressure and kind of healthier numbers in their actual blood work. So it's amazing. This mind-body connection is so it's so connected. So paying attention to yourself with awareness, with mindfulness, not with judgment, like, oh no, I'm feeling this again, but curiosity. My heart's beating fast. I am feeling hopeless, or I'm feeling really blue or dark, or I don't know what this night is going to bring. I don't know if I'll be able to sleep through the night because my child might need me. And that dread that parents feel when they're wondering if they're up for this job. All of those kind of feelings, I think, with compassionate awareness and community, having community again, having friends, family that you feel is supportive, next door neighbors. We need to get into community again, I think.
Yeah, I
We
agree
are
with that.
very lonely right now.
Yeah, I had started during the pandemic, Am I the Only One, on Sundays, like on Instagram, because a lot of parents felt that their own troubles were only theirs. And I was trying to show them, like somebody would post, am I the only one that has a child who doesn't want to brush their teeth? And then you would have like 60% of parents, and they would write to me personally and say, I thought I was the only one.
Oh, that's
It's so good.
beautiful.
It really does.
That was leveraging it, leveraging social media to help people feel less alone. I love that.
But parenting is very lonely. I find, and I was lucky that when I had my first child 7 years ago, there were communities and I can go for walks with moms, but it still felt lonely when you're home and, you don't know if you're doing the right thing. And even if you have people to call sometimes, it's not easy.
It's not easy.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's quite anything in our lives that have such high stakes. It's feels different than like maybe a different identity, like your work or something like that. But our children are, it's such a big responsibility. It feels so overwhelming sometimes and lonely.
Yes, and I think you also discover new parts of yourself that you didn't know were there, because like I said, you never had to deal with a tantrum or anything. You just had to you took care of yourself, and now there's somebody else there, and all of a sudden you realize there are different layers of yourself that you never explored. And I think that's been my big journey in parenting. You talk about something in your latest book, which is the body budget. Is it? No, wait, was it? Yeah,
the body budget.
And I absolutely love that. Can you explain that a little bit more? And I think it just helps us bring all this together in terms of like being able to observe our child and understand what's going on.
I love, it's actually not my term. It's again, I'm Lisa Feldman Barrett's term, the body budget. It's her word for the scientific concept of allostasis, which is basically the way the systems of our body stay balanced. But you don't have to remember that word, the fancy word, but the body budget is saying that everything that happens to us, every interaction we have with people, everything we eat, every movement we make influences our body budget, ours and our children's. And we can think about it, actually, it's so elegant because we can think about it as like a financial budget. Sometimes we get depleted. Sometimes your bank account is running really low. For humans, that can happen from so many things, but lack of sleep, lack of emotional support, not eating enough food, being dehydrated, incubating a virus, there's again, like the iceberg, there's so many things that can take away our body budget. But then there's this wonderful idea about deposits. And sometimes our children need deposits, and a deposit would be a hug, a cozy little reading a book together, or having some special time with a parent, or sitting by by a crackling fire when it's cold, and just kind of enjoying the moment. Those are all like deposits.
Mm.
And when our children misbehave, we have a tendency to try to do withdrawals. Like if it's a again, if it's a body up stress behavior, we have a tendency to think, oh, this needs a withdrawal. This needs punishment. This needs a consequence. This needs a timeout. When in reality, sometimes those little body budgets are depleted and they need deposits, not withdrawals. They need to go to bed, or they need to, to have some encouragement. So the body budget is a very elegant concept that I imported into the parenting world. And I think we're playing around with it, try to make it very useful for parents.
I think it is. I think just having these ideas, everything that you've been mentioning so far, just allow us to see our child a little differently and to learn how to observe them. Because I think the more we learn how to observe our child, any child, because even within my home with three kids, they don't function the same way. They don't have the same needs. They don't have the same sensory needs as well, you know? And I
That's right.
think that as parents, sometimes we look for scripts, exactly what to do and how to do it, and we apply it to our children, but it won't work. So it won't work for every child. We need to really, what you're helping us do is understand how to observe our child and understand their needs so that we can look at it from curiosity and compassion, rather than just disciplining right away. And like you said, with the consequences, which is so helpful to us parents. There's another concept, and you touched upon it just very slightly before. You talked about safety. And I think, sometimes we think of these tantrums again as or big emotions, and I say tantrums, but I want to make sure that I cover older children as well, but these
Yeah.
big emotions, and that we look at these situations as wanting attention or trying to do this on purpose. Sometimes we might forget that there's a reason behind it, but safety is not something that we might think of. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah. That is another kind of mind-blowing concept, that it's a subconscious sense of safety. So it's not, you know, living in a safe house or necessarily. It's this subconscious detection of threat and safety, which is what is happening all the time in our subconscious, in our brain, in our body. Dr. Porges calls it neuroception, and it's actually defined as our human brain is always seeking safety and making sure we're safe. When it detects threat, then it spurs us into action. And usually that at first action, it would be the fight or flight response. And so if we think about threat, then threat is understood in a different way as well. Threat isn't someone like pulling a gun out necessarily, but threat could be, let's say, a smell that the child doesn't even know is very annoying and nauseating to them, right? And all of a sudden you see a behavior come out like 20 minutes later. It could be ambient noise, background and foreground noises. Some children, like the ones that are the frequent getting kicked out of preschool, I found that many of them are hypersensitive to the bouncing off of noise on the walls, which creates this distress, this safety threat in the nervous system. The child doesn't know it, the teacher doesn't know it, but after about an hour, we found with a certain subset of kids, when they were, for example, wearing noise canceling headphones, that their challenging behaviors went way down. So this sense of threat, again, can come from our sensory systems, but it can also come from how, how we interact with our children. So yelling at them, obviously spanking and doing those kinds of things where the adult is not in control definitely hits at a very powerful human threat response. And those kinds of things can change the brain, if it happens long enough, can change the brain to expecting kind of bad things to happen. And we certainly want kids to expect safety rather than threat.
And we don't realize that it can happen really young as well, right? Like I read this study a long time ago, but there was a study where they had infants. I think they were only a few weeks old and they were sleeping, and the parents were having really
Yes.
aggressive arguments or loud arguments while the baby was sleeping, and they would monitor the heart rate, and that would increase, the blood pressure would increase, the
Wow.
breathing would increase, and the baby's sleeping. So I think we, when it comes to threat, it's such an important part for us to talk about, because it doesn't matter if you're pregnant or it's a newborn or it's an 8-year-old, they're going to look for safety within their home, and if it's not there, it'll impact their stress system, as you said. Yeah.
That's powerful. I think I remember that study, and I filed it away. I didn't really want to.
It's been a while. It's old.
Yeah, it was pretty powerful, and I think we don't want parents to feel like, oh my gosh, this is so scary. I could wreck my kid. But I think it's very important to understand that I've heard parents say, well, we can argue in front of our baby because they're so young, they don't know what's happening. They don't know it, but they can hear the sense of the tone of voice.
Yeah.
And that's a trigger for this for the stress response. So
Yeah.
it's
and there
very
has to be
good point.
consistency. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I never want parents to feel bad, or if they're in a certain situation right now and they're listening to this and they maybe the house environment is not a safe one right now. It's about consistency, and the child, I think, I don't remember who said this, but like all you need is one safe connection with an adult, I think, or a caregiver, right? And
That's
then it
right.
kind of helps with the healing process, or the helping that child.
It's an anchor.
Yeah.
All you need is one.
Yeah.
One adult. So many, I don't know if it's Edtronic or probably a number of researchers, but it might have been guy from the University of Alan Sroufe. He's great. He's one of the main attachment researchers, but an adult who sees the child's distress, one adult, is really incredible. That can be the anchor, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the other part about, if you're concerned or worried about your child, say they were experiencing a stressful classroom and the other thing to remember is that stress becomes toxic when it is over and over and over again. So single events or events that happen every so often in the presence of loving caregivers isn't going to cause your child's brain to change in a unhealthy way. So I think we also have to realize the power of the parent, the power of a one consistent parent.
Yes. I guess to end this conversation, I'd love to hear from you in terms of maybe things that we need to be aware of when our child is very young to help them with their behavior and emotions as they're growing up. And maybe summarizing a little bit about what we said, like what are the 3 most important things that parents should try to apply or be mindful of? So let's start with maybe the first part of, when they're very young, what should we make sure we are mindful of in terms of those building stones, stepping stones?
Yeah, the most important characteristic when they're very young, from pregnancy, birth, and the first year, is responsive care. And what responsive care is meeting that baby's need when the baby has it to your best ability. So when a baby cries, we comfort them. And sometimes it won't help, but at least we try. If they're hungry, we feed them. If they need a diaper change, we change it. We respond in real time to their needs. Responsive care is tied more than anything else to the development of resilience in human beings. So respond. Take away the noise that tells you that if you over respond to a baby, you might spoil them or something like that. Right. That is the key for our little ones. And then I think as they get older, we didn't talk about this, but the idea that every single child has their own challenge zone. So as good parents, we do want our children to stretch and to grow. And if we're protecting them, it's not even possible to protect them from every challenge, right? We wouldn't want to. We just want to have this watchful, curious eye to see if they're consistently in their challenge zone or if they're going over it. So if what the experiences are that your child is involved in are, and that could be everything from daily living activities to the type of academics they're in, if it's consistently putting them into above their challenge zone, we want to move it down to meet that particular child's needs.
That's such a good point.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think responsive care on the front end, and then following each child to make sure that their body budget isn't too extendedly stretched, or that they're just chilling and not really learning new things, because
That's true.
adversity is part of being human.
Yeah.
Feeling uncomfortable is part of being human, and that's okay as long as you have a wonderful caregiver there noticing it, being present with you, being curious with you, and helping you essentially like digest and metabolize difficult emotions.
I love that. That's, especially with that challenge, we do want to protect and help our kids, and we don't want them to feel uncomfortable or sad or mad in these situations, but they really need to experience those. It's just so hard for us parents, I think, sometimes to see them that way. And you just want to, here, let me do it for you.
Yes.
Let me end this moment for you.
Oh, yes. It's so we love them so much. And tolerating our own distress and their distress, I think, is a project. I know as a mom of adult children, I'm still working on that in myself. So it's a developmental project. Yeah.
What are some hopes you have with regards to our system right now, and what changes you'd love to see in the next 10 years? 10 years, hopefully, maybe.
I am hoping that we will move from the well-intentioned label of being trauma informed. That's a label that our systems are using. Oh, this is a trauma informed practice. This is evidence-based practice. I hope we're going to move away from that and towards trauma responsive care. So there are a lot of old studies out there that are being cited as evidence for how we take care of our vulnerable children. Many of those studies on the back end use punitive techniques such as timeouts, holding children in chairs, closing doors, secluding them and restraining them. So my hope and prayer, really, because I believe that we are causing some damage in our public systems, especially, but for our systems to understand that trauma responsive care means paying attention to the nervous system of every caregiver and every child, and making sure that they're not living in threat or terror or fear, making sure they're just in their right cozy challenge zone.
I love that. I'm happy I asked you. I wanted to hear that from you. I do think we need a lot of changes in our system, and you are right on. That is the first and most important one. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. Where can we find you, and how can we learn from you?
Oh, thank you. Really enjoyed our conversation. My website is monadelahooke.com. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, Dr. Mona Delahooke. And my latest book is Brain Body Parenting, and I'm going to be launching a parent community, a membership community, the Brain Body Parenting Collective, in August. So more information on my website. And I'm just really very excited to continue the conversation with parents, support parents, and support each other, because there are no 100% answers. As you know, new research is coming out every day. The brain is still a new frontier. So this is something we'll all do together. We'll learn together.
I can't wait. Thank you. And we'll have all the links to what you just mentioned in our show notes. Thank you to everyone for listening. And we will be, I can't wait to speak to you guys again. Thank you.